Now, I'm one of those who played the original when it first came out, so for me this game has a sort of context, and with that there would be certain expectations that would need to be met. But before we get into any of that, let's cover some of the other things first. Given that the remake is 20 years after the first game came out, there were obviously going to be huge differences in graphic fidelity compared to the first game, as well as difference in animation, physics, etc. Obviously the game has far more detail to it than the original, and this adds to the atmosphere and the post-apocalypse that is Raccoon City after the outbreak. One way this is done is through the high level of detail found in various places and rooms, which give a greater sense of the disarray within Raccoon City. This can be seen with the burnt out cars and wrecks at the beginning. As you go into the police station, this is further seen with the level of detail seen in the damage to the rooms, or the way stuff is strewn across rooms. Differences in lighting also add to this, and here modern lighting effects such as use of the flashlight add to the tension in dark areas. This is something that was not seen, or should I say was less feasible, with the tech back in 1998. However, this particular example only happens in a few parts of the police station. A combination of graphic fidelity, animation and to some degree physics adds to the way the zombies have been modernized in the game, and in turn this has fundamentally changed how zombies have affected how you play the game. Zombies are much more formidable enemies, they just don't go down with a few shots, like in the original. That means that at least at the beginning of the game, thought has to be put into how you engage them and when. You are thinking about things like health and ammo, which adds to the management of resources, which is another central part of the gameplay. In the case of the zombies, at least at the beginning of the game, it could be argued that it's further enhanced the resource management aspect of the gameplay. So you are left at many times either avoiding zombies or making certain well-placed shots, sometimes aiming to remove limbs or to immobilize rather than to kill. Modern animation adds to the movement patterns, which can make shot placement difficult, especially when playing this game on hardcore mode. They have the ability to go through doors, which further changes up the gameplay and how you deal with them. There's something very satisfying when you finally take a zombie down. This is aided by the high detail of animation when shooting off flesh, heads or limbs off. The high level of detail in both graphics and animation as well as sound design aid in the immersion when encountering zombies. But I'd like to point out that also I think good art direction played an equally important role, as well as graphic fidelity and new physics and animation. As I mentioned before, as you progress through the game, more powerful guns become available, making the challenging aspect of dealing with the zombies less so, as you're able to make one-off headshots. Where modern graphics and voice acting has really helped is in the recreating of the cutscenes. This has added to the narrative and realism in these scenes. When I say realism, what I mean is that they have far more detail. There isn't much to say here other than that they seem better and more detailed. One aspect where they do stand out is in the voice acting. Clearly this is of a much better quality in terms of quality of writing and voice acting, and is what I would say is the main difference that mattered the most, or was a much bigger departure in terms of necessity. The first Resident Evil worked because it employed a combination of combat, resource gathering as well as the management of those resources, and puzzle solving, which employed the need for backtracking across areas and various patterns in order to collect parts to solve those puzzles. All these layers are necessary for making the gameplay so engaging. It is this management of these different factors and their different variations that make the gameplay work so well. There's a sort of satisfaction that comes with finally solving a puzzle or obtaining an item, as well as collecting documents and codes that lead to more resources. There's one particular task where you developing a film helps you gain access to the location of much needed resources. There's also an odd level of satisfaction that comes from managing inventory in an efficient manner. One of the reasons I chose hardcore mode was for the manual saving. This obviously gave you another aspect to consider in the game, but also made you consider retaining ink ribbons, although to be fair the game seems to be generous with the amount of ink ribbons you have access to. Could I say that the remake has altered or enhanced these gameplay mechanics in any way? Well no, apart from more detailed animations and lighting, I would say not, and I would also add that they did not need to be enhanced in any way. It worked back in 1998, and they work now in the same manner. The only thing the modern game did, I would say, is make them more realistic or plausible in the more detailed environment of the game. I would say that the game did a very good job trying to stay true to the original layout, while also capitalizing on modern capabilities, such as not having to load each time you enter a room. This also gave way to the ability to create much more detailed rooms and areas, outlining everyday objects and therefore adding to the immersion of the game. The boss fights themselves are pretty rudimentary. In some ways they try to copy the original boss fights while modernizing them, with say more movement in some encounters, but other than that they're pretty straightforward, focusing on shooting weak points. In the case of Birkin, this is usually his many eyes that are the weak point. Given everything else this game aims to reimagine, it would not concern me that the boss fights were not taken to a whole new level. I don't think this would have been necessary for the game, as developers would have had a lot on their plate reimagining the whole game as well as modernizing aspects of it. There probably wasn't the time to totally redo the boss fights, which is unnecessary in my opinion, as it would not have added more to the gameplay, as these are only brief moments in the game. Also, doing so may have caused inconsistencies in the gameplay that would have stood out too much. In outlining the differences, I think that it is important to outline what I saw as the major one, which is the alternative playthroughs of the game, which to me seemed like the biggest difference. Both Leon and Claire had fundamentally different playthroughs in the original, with their own alternative playthroughs. These alternative playthroughs were achieved through different paths, access to different areas, etc., thus giving you 4 alternative playthroughs altogether. To me this was a disappointment, as it gave the original game so much more replayability. To me this would not have been such a hassle remaking those alternative playthroughs, as it meant only tweaking a few things here and there. But having thought it over, I have to consider a couple of things. Firstly, was the remake production, such as it was, a very long process that did not give the development team the necessary time and the right level of quality to produce these alternative playthroughs? Was it something that if left out would have been noticed? You have to consider that this game was made 20 years ago, so how much of the current audience that played this game would have played the original game? Another difference that stood out to me was the tone of this game. I'd say that it had a fundamentally darker tone to that of the original. Darker and gritty, because of the detail that the graphics provided, as well as through the use of detailed gore, and the use of darker music and more professional voice acting. Another aspect is the lighting techniques, which I mentioned earlier regarding the flashlight. This again added to a level of immersion, which is another difference. I think it's a toss-up between how much this had to do with the latest graphics versus the art direction. In the case of the dark corridors and lighting, this seems apparent that it leans more to the new game engine and its graphics capabilities. I'm curious in terms of the flashlight, to what degree is this an artistic choice or something enabled through new graphics capabilities, or a combination of the two? Where I would say modern hardware has helped is in helping create more complex animations, which is added to the immersion. Again, this would primarily be focused upon the zombies in terms of the way they move, which creates challenges when trying to place a shot on them, and to a lesser extent with other enemies like the dogs. As I mentioned before, good game design to me seems to come about through a combination of different mechanics working together, which enables, in my opinion, constant stimulation because of the constant management of these different mechanics. I have mixed opinions of this game. On one hand, it's an excellent remake that understands the fundamentals of what made the original so good, and builds upon that. Having said that, I feel that this game was needed before going ahead with other remakes within the Resident Evil universe. Also, going back to Resident Evil 2 from 1998 does limit or create boundaries to what could have been done, but that's just the nature of a remake. Ultimately, to make a good remake means having the fundamentals of those mechanics the same as in the original. Therefore, I wonder whether this could have been done without having to go down the remake path. I think as a remake it did a lot to reimagine and modernise the gameplay for the modern age. But given what I have mentioned before, the game left me feeling empty somewhat because it did not match my exact expectations from the original.